Henry DeVries, welcome to Starting Different. Welcome everybody, Starting Different. Today I have an opportunity for us to learn from and be improved by my friend Henry, who is the guy behind more than 300 business books, including 12 of his own. I call Henry the book whisperer because he helped me whisper mine into existence. Henry, tell us about this, this subtitle we have here for you, Chief Encouragement Officer. Where did that CEO title come from?
Well, when I decided 6 years ago to leave the university, I didn't want to be just a ghostwriter, and I thought, what's a cool title? CEO, that's a cool title. I'll be the CEO of Indie Books International. And I got an email that people were exchanging. They didn't know that they had accidentally copied me on it, but they had. And they said, should we have Henry DeVries come in and speak? And somebody responded, oh, I've heard Henry speak before. All he does is he encourages everybody to write a book. And I thought, oh, that's perfect. That's what I do. So I'm the Chief Encouragement Officer.
Absolutely.
I think he was slamming me. I embraced it.
Wonderful, and that's what we do. That's what we do. We take that chapter, that comment, and we turn it into part of our story. And guys, I want you thinking about this on this webinar today. What is your story? Every person, every project, every team, every company has a story. And I start these sessions starting different. The morning of the session, I send my guest a picture of the sunrise. And Henry, I apologize because you're out in San Diego and this was the sunrise in Florida at 7 a.m. But we're going to use a starting button. I had my artist put together. It's a button and a sunrise. And I want to start with this concept. Your story can change someone's life. And I want to emphasize that you guys, every single person on this phone call can make a difference for others with the stories you tell, and your story itself can change. No chapter is a whole story, no event is a whole story, nothing we're going through with COVID is the entire story. So Henry, I'm going to put an image up on the board and then we're going to talk about why I am wearing my Emperor uniform today. So of all the human beings that have ever lived, this individual had more stories written about him. One researcher suggests the number is over 300,000 academic papers, political papers, military papers. Napoleon Bonaparte. So I am in full sweatshirt conquer mode for us today. And Henry's going to talk to you about 8 different kinds of stories. And I believe you'll understand as we're talking about that, how every single one of those types can refer back to Napoleon, whether it was a campaign, whether it was part of his life, whether it was him growing up on a little tiny island and not even being French. And Henry's going to talk to you about 3 characters to think about once you've identified the kind of story you want to tell. And I believe you guys will see that Napoleon can represent all 3 of those characters. But here's how I want to start. I want to start with a little fact and a little science. People are going to tell stories about you no matter what. Your customers are going to tell stories. Your team's going to tell stories. Your family's going to tell stories. And I want you to consider this question. Who is controlling the narrative? So again, one piece of brain science, Henry, before we jump in, because my focus is brain science and how to help people, help others make decisions faster. This piece of brain science is all about setting context with your stories. It's called perceptual contrast. And it basically says this: you can change how someone feels about you based on the context you set, the things you give them to feel before that thing. So 3 buckets: room temperature, ice bucket, and hot bucket. Depending on which bucket I put your hand in first, that's how you're going to feel the middle bucket. So that's what you can do with stories. And folks, you're all in a process of becoming. Some of you will become legends this year. Some of you, like my bank, are going to be legendary for how terrible you were this year. But here's the bluff, the bottom line up front. The bottom line up front. What if there was a button that you could push to tell your story, to elevate, educate, inspire, to influence, to entertain? What if there was a button in your brain that you could push? Well, guess what? You would hit that button, wouldn't you? So Henry's here to tell us how to hit that button, but I want to draw the link for you. Every single guest I've had on has come on to help you hit a button to reframe your story. Dr. Bill Crawford said, the stories we tell ourselves, we can eliminate anxiety in less than 8 seconds. Michael Olaso, a Hollywood actor, said, you're always on stage. It's always a part. How do you prepare yourself for you on your best day? Rob Cujo Teschner, Air Force, talked about how every flight, basically the Air Force insists that the pilots tell a story. It's called a debrief, and they document what happened. Okay, so there's a thread going through this. And two things, Henry, I want you to consider for the audience. The second piece of brain science, and then I'll let you jump in. The brain sparks. It uses energy at the beginning and end of any event. So as you're considering the kinds of stories you can tell and how to frame them, think about where you tell them to people. At the beginning of a meeting, at the end of a meeting, at the beginning of a training session, the end of a training session, the beginning of listen, whether you're a preacher, whether you're a salesperson, whether you're a CEO, whether you're just a parent, you have moments of power. All right, Henry, let's jump in. 300 books. Give us a little background on some of the stuff we're seeing. I see one of my favorite friends and co-authors, Bill Woodich, was on this webcast a few weeks ago. Talk to us about Persuade with a Story. No, let's start with the Warren Buffett book. This was one of the 12 books you've authored. Tell us a little bit about that book and how it's and where it is in the world today.
Yeah, well, that's my McGraw-Hill International bestseller. I wrote it with Tom Searcy, and it's How to Close a Deal Like Warren Buffett. We're in 5 languages, including Chinese. So I might be really big in China. I don't know. But, I have the book. It's just great to see yourself in Chinese. I think that's great.
So I'm going to ask you about the cowboy hat in a minute, but let me ask you about the Pirates hat, because it's not just that you're a Pirates fan, it's that you had a goal, and I think our buddy Bill was helping you achieve part of that goal. Tell the audience what your goal was.
Sure, I'm a baseball nut on a personal note. I love baseball. I'm a former Associated Press baseball sports writer. I have visited 34 Major League Baseball parks, and I've got 2 to go before I touch them all. This is Bill Woodich, who's been on the call, and one of our authors. And we were in, actually, we had just seen you. We were in New Jersey, and I said, I've never been to a Pirates game where he's from. And Bill said, well, let me rent a plane. And I said, oh no, I've already rented a Toyota to drive across Pennsylvania because I want to see Gettysburg and a train museum on the way. So we went to Pittsburgh, and he bought me a Pop Stargell hat to wear in honor. We're just about to cross the Roberto Clemente Bridge. He's from Western Pennsylvania. Yeah.
Pretty cool. So now tell us about the book we're going to talk about today, because I know that one of the things you were able to accomplish, and you and I are both affiliated in many ways with Vistage, and I suggested that it might be one of the ways for you to see all these parks would be to start delivering more Vistage talks, and I think that was it. But tell us about the book. Tell us what the title means and why this book was put together.
Sure. Well, actually, you said I should be a Vistage speaker, and I said, well, they don't really want it from me. And you said, oh, I think you're wrong on that one. That thing you do with teaching people how to persuade with a story, they would want to hear that. And so that was the book and the Vistage Talk. So I help business leaders use a story to persuade job prospects, job candidates or prospective clients, or even investors, and not to be a grandpa who starts off telling a story. It's how you end. You talked about the beginning and the end. Ending with a powerful story, sometimes with a speech, beginning with a powerful story and ending with a powerful story can make all the difference, because human brains are hardwired for stories.
They love it. And it is the most powerful part of any workshop. You know, I had a chance to listen in to the third time to a workshop with my friend Cujo, Robert Teschner. He had me listen in with a Vistage group on Monday. There was one story he told, and I've shared it now with you and others, that literally has changed my life. So we've always learned from stories, and there are some things in the readings that you've done, some frameworks that you can give us to think about stories. And you would suggest, Henry, that every great story has three primary characters or people who play parts, correct?
It's easy to tell a story if you just remember 1, 2, 3, hero, nemesis, mentor.
So
And
I'm gonna say each word, and you give me an example of your favorite one of each, or you could pick one story and give us the three in each. But hero.
Star Wars, Luke Skywalker. Luke Skywalker, and now the updated version, Rey, is the main character of the story. Sometimes people get hung up on hero, that the hero is heroic. It just means the protagonist, the main character, the person driving the story.
All
And
right,
a
Luke's
nemesis,
nemesis.
Darth Vader, ultimately the emperor. Darth Vader. So a nemesis, sometimes when you're telling a business story, doesn't have to be a person. It could be COVID-19. It could be the recession of 2008. It could be the Affordable Care Act. The IRS are always a great nemesis in a story.
You had an interesting point that you made in the book and you made in my work with you over the years, which is when a business leader is writing a book, who should they always make the hero?
They should always make their client, the client who they took from mess to success. So they're the mentor character. They're the Yoda. They're the Obi-Wan Kenobi.
I
Because the main character followed your wisdom and advice, they succeeded. So you're in the story. You're doing a noble work in the story. You don't have to be the hero. If you're the hero, you made your client the damsel in distress. Nobody wants to be the damsel in distress.
So who's your favorite character, Henry, in all of books or all of movies? Who's your favorite of these three? Who was your one favorite character?
Joseph from the book of Genesis. Joseph, whose brothers threw him in a well, sold him into slavery. He winds up in Potiphar's house as a slave, and he does such a good job. Even though he's thrown in there, he works so hard. Potiphar makes him the head of the house, and then something bad happens. Not his fault, but Potiphar's wife wants to
All right,
lay
hold
down.
on, because you're already getting into plot flow and all of that, and I'm going to take you there in a second. We'll stick with Joseph, but my favorite character in all of books or movies is Winston Wolfe from Pulp Fiction. He's not the main character, but he's the guy the main character calls when he's in trouble. Okay, so now let's talk about what kinds of stories there are. For example, that story of Joseph, of the 8 main kinds of stories, which kinds of stories would that story be?
Um, you could call Joseph an escape story because in a normal place, he's loved by his father. This bad thing happens. He's thrown into jail in Egypt. He winds up escaping that by being Pharaoh's right-hand man, and he even forgives his brothers in the end for what they did to him.
So
So
different stories throughout human history have had different goals. We're going to talk about them in a minute, but I just want to go through 8 of the types of stories. And for the folks who are watching this, you might want to write these down and both think about what your favorite type of story is and what kind of story you can tell about your company, about you yourself. And by the way, stories can change, right? So I'll go through each one, and Henry, give me an example, and see if we can make it a business example, because I think we can pretty much identify our fictional examples, but from a nonfiction perspective, give me an example of a monster story.
Sure. Well, Jaws and Dracula in literature. In business book, it's Whale Hunting by my friend Tom Searcy, which is really Moby Dick for business. The monster that you're chasing is the big whale account. And how do you, that's your Moby Dick. How do you bring it in?
Okay, number 2, give us some examples of an underdog story.
Well, an underdog story is a Cinderella story, a David versus Goliath story. So in business books, it might be Moneyball by Michael Lewis about the Oakland A's, how, oh, we're poor, we don't have the budget of the Yankees or the Red Sox, but we're plucky and we've got a great idea. We're going to find broken toy ball players with computers.
So it's a Rocky Balboa story.
Absolutely.
Number 3, Henry, a comedy. Give us a business book that's a comedy.
Yeah, comedy is about solving things with a wacky idea. I think Sir Richard Branson from Virgin and his story about the Virgin business line and what they've done in trains and planes and other things is is a comedy story that has a happy ending.
And you have been, I think, trying to write some comedy screenplays, but I don't want to give up the secret here for a number. So let me move on because that
Okay.
might be a tragedy. I'm not sure, but talk to us about tragedies.
Tragedy is when it's about problem solving when you make a tragic mistake because you're trying to take a shortcut against the laws of God or nature or man. In business, Too Big to Fail, The Big Short, Barbarians at the Gate. These are all tragic stories, just like The Godfather or Breaking Bad.
Number 5, a quest.
A quest is a search for a prize, how to close a deal like Warren Buffett, how to win friends and influence people, the 7 habits of highly effective people. These are all quests. You're after a prize, just like Indiana Jones is looking for the Ark of the Covenant.
I love quest. I love quest stories. I love quest books. I love quest movies. And I thought that was my favorite, but really number 7 is my favorite, but we're not there yet. Tell us about an escape story and how that would relate to business.
When you're in a normal place, you go to a crazy place, you go back to normal. And if you think of Alice in Wonderland or Dorothy Gale and The Wizard of Oz, in business,
wait a second. Didn't you say The Wizard of Oz is one of the greatest chick flicks of all time because it involved
2 women fighting over a pair of shoes?
Now, two people know each other too well when they're sharing each other's punchlines.
Yeah.
All right. So we got quest, we got an escape, and folks, as you're going through this, think about Napoleon and his life. Every single one of these stories is why there's 300,000 books written about Napoleon. There's a monster story, an underdog story. The guy escaped and became emperor twice. Okay. But my favorite story, the more I think about it, is number 7. Henry, talk to us about rebirth stories.
It's a rebirth. It's the phoenix rising. It's starting different. Starting different is rebirth. My story is a rebirth story. Rebirth is what was dead has come back to life. It's the comeback story. It's the redemption story. Christmas Carol is a redemption story. So in business,
also was self-published by Dickens because his publishers didn't think it was going to be a hit.
He had to go to a moneylender and sort of like borrowing through the SBA through COVID-19.
All right, but you've shared with me that your favorite stories are the 8, the mysteries. Tell me why, and give us an example of a mystery from a business perspective.
Sure, because you're thinking Sherlock Holmes and Agatha Christie and all that, but Who Moved My Cheese is a mystery story. 12 million copies sold. I bumped into Spencer Johnson, the late Spencer Johnson, when he was alive. He came to one of my book launch parties, and I said, it's such an honor to meet you. You know, between the 2 of us, Spencer, we've sold 12 million books. And he said, actually, Henry, between the 2 of us, we've sold 25 million books. He was the co-author with Ken Blanchard of The 1 Minute Manager, which also sold 12 million.
And it's a great joke I stole from you when you allowed me to meet Ken Blanchard at one of your events. So we got 8 kinds of stories. Okay. Yeah. Now walk us through the process. How do you tell a story, and how do you think about, Henry, when you're working with an author or yourself, how do you think about following these steps as you're telling the story?
Well, there are emotional beats to any story. So the first one is there's a before. We have to meet the main character in their normal life, what they're doing. And then there's an introduction of the villain or the nemesis or the problem or the challenge. Something happens that's going to force them to change their life. And that's when the third thing happens. I call it enter the mentor. So you have cue the guru. I like that. So somebody comes in, and that's when you're telling the business story, that's you, where you meet the person and you find out what they want and tell them it's not going to be easy. The next part, that focus on them, is about the struggle. If we saw a movie and Yoda says, oh, you know, you must oppose the Force, and Luke Skywalker says, got it, and the next scene is he's blowing up the Death Star, you'd say, well, that's a lousy movie. He had to struggle to get there. Just like in business and life, we have to go through the struggle.
Just
We're
like
in,
what they said, just like John Travolta said to Winston Wolfe when he got there. You know, he
yeah.
was it. You know, you wish the hero would sometimes just take the damn direction, don't you, from the guru?
Well, they always have to give pushback. There's some pushback in the story because
Step number
it'd be
five.
like the Brady
Yep, go
Bunch.
ahead.
He said, well, thanks, Dad. I never looked at it that way, and then just did it. That's boring. So the hero has to overcome. After the struggle, they cross that visible finish line that they declared for themselves. And so we all know, they did it. And then you give the lesson. Uh, People might hear the Aesop fable about the tortoise and the hare, and many will come up with the lesson is persistence pays off, slow and steady wins the race. But other people might say, oh, well, truth, or, don't take a nap or what. They might not get it. So it's you as the
Well,
storyteller need to frame it at the end, your alpha and omega, Dino, that
yeah.
you give it to them at the end what the meaning was.
Well, and the interesting thing about this lesson is I think having gone through the process and with you of telling my story and writing my first book, I realized how much of a lesson there was for me. If the tortoise had told the story, there would be a different lesson. If the hare had told the story. So the thing I want to share with you guys that as you go through this process, you're actually learning yourself. And I'm going to tell you there's at least 7 different intentions. I want you to be deliberate before you tell a story. I want you to ask yourself, what's the goal of the story? So I've listed 7 here. Is your goal to elevate the audience? Is your goal to elevate your client? Is your goal to educate or inspire? Or do you want to influence them? Do you want to make a sale? Is your goal to just entertain? These are all viable goals. Or is your goal, like the story that my client Mark Lang is telling within his organization now, is your goal to illuminate a path forward? You know, Cujo has a really, Rob Teschner, that Air Force pilot I was telling you about, has a really cool concept he's been sharing with people that your goal right now during COVID should be to memorialize, to create a book, a 3-ring binder of what your company went through and be able to tell that story and learn from it. So everyone on this call, Henry, doesn't matter if they own their own company. Tom Peters nailed it back in '99. Everyone is a brand. Everyone has projects. Everyone has services they're provided. And folks, there's books in each of those things. There's stories, and there's a secret in putting together a book. You know, everything, Henry, is a secret until you find someone who can teach it to you. So a little background on how we met. Henry, what do you remember before I share with the audience what I remember about meeting you?
I remember that I determined that my ideal prospect was a Vistage speaker who didn't have a book yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I through a little Sherlock Holmes work, I put together a list of Vistage speakers, and the top 3 at the list, Dean Menudo was at the top of that list. So from there, I sent out direct mail.
I walked to my mailbox, and in the back of my mind, for years, I've known I need a book. For years, I've wanted to write a book. And I open up the greatest direct mail piece I ever have. It says, it's time to write the book. Clients have been, and by the way, at this point, I had already been doing what I've been doing for 20 years. And I was in the midst of a year at Vistage, largest speakers network, largest CEO membership organization world. That year, I had 150 Vistage Talk scheduled. I called Henry immediately because he wrote me this letter. It says, here's who I am. Here's what I do. Here's all the other Vistage speakers and chairs I've done it for, and I can do it for you. And by the way, he told me he could get it done in 90 days. I said, Henry, I'm hiring you, but we're not going to be able to get started till the end of the year because I was so busy, folks. But once we started that process, and there is a process to follow in building a book, what I learned as we were going through and as I built this book and then started giving them away and getting more and more talks and ordering more is that first you build your book, but really your book and your story builds you. One of the coolest letters I've ever received is from my Aunt Lorraine, my mom's eldest sister. She sent me this letter when she was 83 years old, congratulating me for writing a book. And she even talked about the T in my trust model, because Henry and I had models that I was using and stories I was telling, and I had a lot of this format done. If you guys were to see the back cover of my book, there's a line there, and the one I'm most proud of is this little quote on the back cover of my book. Henry and I are sitting across from each other. He's listening to my stories, and I say, success in sales is not about making a commission. It's about making a difference. And Henry says,
that's going in the book. It's actually going on the back cover of the book.
so this process, and by the way, the process that I outline in the one-page sales coach is one that you can follow. Henry has shared with me he does in helping people identify what their books would look like. So there's a 4-box model. I call it OPSC. That's the trademark model, one-page sales coach. Think about the outcomes. What do you do? Who have you done it for? How could you demonstrate the results? But then work back. What are the problems before that the hero experienced? What are the solutions after? What was that struggle in the middle? See it in 3D, dollars, data, and delta. And what commitment are you looking for from next steps? So I walk you guys through this because this book, I started traveling with a case of them. I ended up having to mail 2 or 3 pieces of luggage ahead of me because there were so many requests for the book and to speak. But it's not my story here. It's the story of Henry. So, and let's get back to that. And that is a story of a storyteller. So Henry, let's give people a sense of how you become a writer and how you become the author of 12 books and a guy who's helped 263 folks like me get theirs done. Tell us what we're looking at here.
Well, my career started at the age of 6 when I was hired by my father to work on the family dairy farm. And I was paid 25 cents a week for 7 days a week. And it wasn't until I gave his eulogy in 2012. He was my best friend. I got to spend the first part of my life working with my best friend, and we were in contact every week for the rest of his life. I realized that he didn't need a 6-year-old to help run his business. He was teaching a 6-year-old how to run a business one day. His real love was horse racing. He also raised horses in addition to doing that. But he also knew his son loved baseball. From an early age, I just fell in love with baseball. I wasn't very.
So tell us about the picture in the middle.
You're about 15.
You're about 8. You're 15 in this picture.
15.
And you're a sports writer.
I actually was hired as a sports writer professionally when I was 15.
Wow.
Yeah.
So who's the guy you're with here with the LA Cats?
That's Wally Moon, who this is when I was 18 and first got into sports writing and sports photography, and I'd always grown up loving this player and got a press pass for an old timers game to meet him, and he was very gracious. Wow. We actually became buddies in the last years of his life, and got to meet and talk and do different things. And
so Henry, you are a story made up of incredible stories. I would say to someone, if they want to know Henry, I would ask them, what do milk cows, the mafia, and baseball have in common? And if you can somehow weave the family feud into this,
we'll go back a slide if you could.
I sure can.
Okay, go back a slide. That's I had a wacky idea to get the family on Family Feud when it first came out, and that's us. So that's my dairy farmer father and my waitress mother. My mom had been a waitress in Rochester, New York, where you're from, and she was a what would you call it? A mascot of the Mafia Don. She worked for the Mafia when she was 16. And her mother was the president of the Christian Temperance Union in Rochester. So,
well, there's entire books there, but I want to make sure folks know that this cow is okay. This is actually what you call a bovine podiatrist.
Yeah, my father, when he realized his only son was not going to take that dairy over, sold it and became a dairy cattle hoof trimmer, or as he liked to say, bovine podiatrist. I could have inherited that business too. That could have all been mine. But,
all been yours.
I walked away from it and went into writing.
My point here in showing this is we all in our families have been taught things. That's an invisible curriculum. What Henry helps people do, and what I try to do also with clients, is make the invisible visible and create intentional curriculums. So you had a couple people who were mentors to you, and we have a few minutes left before we close up because we're almost at the 30-minute mark.
I started writing professionally at 15 for the town newspaper, and my sister's grandfather-in-law, Grandpa Roper, an old newspaper man, he would have me visit him every week, and he would critique we'd critique my stories with how to make them better. He was encouraging and gave
So
me a
that
book about the Associated Press, and it became a dream, and I worked for them one day. Gary
Tell us
Hawk.
about Gary Hawk and the 4 questions, because I want folks to ask themselves these 4 questions in terms of starting different, because he helped you start different, correct?
Yeah, I was 44. I had been running an advertising and PR agency of my own for 2 years. Gary took me to lunch. He was my business coach, my chair, and asked me questions about, what do you want to do next? I said, well, 10 years from now, I want to teach consultants and business leaders how to market with a book and a speech. And he said, how are you
That's
going to do
question
that?
number 1, folks. Question number 1, what do you want to do next? In 10 years, what do you want to be doing? Question number 2, Henry?
So question number 2 was, well, how would you do it? And I said, well, I'd write books and articles and give speeches and workshops, and I'd do all these things. Then 3 said, you sound passionate. Why do you want to do that? Why do you want to wait 10 years to follow your passion? And that was a gut check question. But he let me off the hook with question 4, how can you start in a small way? And
Start
this was
small.
back in 2001. I just started putting on lunch and learns and sharing with people. And that led to writing 11 more books on the subject and being a national speaker and all great things.
So let me encourage the audience here as I'm closing up to think about how can you start small. First, I want you to think about what your intention would be in writing a book. Think about these 7 intentions and pick one. And then I want to ask you to think about who would be the hero, who would be the nemesis, and who would be the mentor in that book, in that story. 8 kinds of stories. Pick one that you want to tell. And let me give you a really simple way to start going about this. Henry and I have been talking about the what of storytelling, why you should do it and how, but let me, because I see things, I see shortcuts, and stories have always been shortcuts for human beings. This is a shortcut at the Wills Eye Hospital. I started going blind when I was 17. When I got to Wills and I saw this sign, that was a story, and I felt safe. Businesses tell stories as shortcuts. This is the story that Ray Kroc was telling at McDonald's in the 70s. So I want you guys to think about even a tip cup on a bar tells a story. The story says other people found this bartender of value. You might consider this in telling your story. Pick a few clients that you have and ask them these 3 questions. Number 1, what was the problem that you solved for them? Number 2, how are they different today than they were yesterday? And how are you different from others they could have used? And number 3, how would they describe working with you to someone who has never heard of you before? This is 3 really powerful questions for you to get testimonials. I could give you the brain science behind it, but don't worry about that. What you need to focus on is this. Becoming better is a process. That process begins every day. Every day is a new chapter. Every one of us is a work in progress. Forward motion comes from stories, which are forcing mechanisms to get people moving. You can create a space for those things to happen. Henry, final thoughts before I close up here, because we're at about the 32-minute mark. What did we leave out? Any last thing you want to comment on?
3 words: your stories matter. The world doesn't need another cheesy business book with some advice. The world needs your stories. Your people need your stories. The next generation at your business need your stories. They matter.
Thank you. HD's contact information. He's made an offer. If any of you want, he will send or have someone on his team send you the PDF of the electronic version of the book Persuade with a Story. If you send him an email, henry@indiebooks.com. Henry's on LinkedIn as well. And Henry has also made another offer. If you are ready and want to talk about the strategies involved in putting a book, there's an expert that can help you. It's Devin. That is Henry's daughter. So closing up, folks, next week, I have my friend Kirby Martzel, who was the reason that this title came to be in terms of starting different. Henry, I want to thank you for being a part of this webcast. The journey is every day, folks. Improve 1%. In 70 days, you're twice as good as you are now. Henry, I'm going to be saying goodbye. Every day, is a chance for us to be starting different. Folks, you're never starting over, you're always starting different. Thank you, brother. I'm going to close up in 3, 2, and 1.